So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's Science Spotlight on how to build habits that stick. I'm Reva, I'm the founder and CEO of One, and I'm really excited today to be moderating the session on habit change with the world's leading expert in the field, Dr. Jud Brewer. So welcome, Jud. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So for context, Dr. Brewer is the director of the Mindfulness Center at Brown University. He's an associate professor in psychiatry at the School of Medicine at Brown and also a research affiliate at MIT. Dr. Brewer has developed a really unique approach to habit building and addiction and has coached world leaders, Olympic athletes, and various government ministers. I'm personally a really big fan of Jud's work and have been following, and I'm an avid reader of Jud's multiple New York Times bestselling books. So I'm excited to be moderating today. Jud also has a famous TED Talk that I would encourage everyone to watch, which is called How to Break a Habit. And it has, I believe, about 20 million views. I'm also excited to be moderating this session at this time of the year because, this is a time, usually the busiest period of the year. I think everyone's calendars are full with lots of festive activities, but also end of year planning. And it also tends to be the time when we start reflecting on the year that's gone and thinking about New Year's resolutions. So the topic is particularly pertinent to everyone here today. In terms of the format, Jud and I will spend about 25 minutes in conversation. I would please ask that you submit any questions that you have in the chat, and we will address them as we go along and also leave some time at the end for some audience Q&A as well. So let's get going. Jud, as I mentioned, right, I've been a big fan of your work. I've read most of your papers and research. I'm also the founder of a preventative health company, and generally consider myself to be on the healthy end of the spectrum. Yet I'm terrible at keeping habits, and maintaining a healthy habit is something that I still struggle with. So I guess my first question to you is, why is it so hard for us to build healthy habits?
That's a great question. And I think we could probably spend an entire hour just talking about that. But to keep it relatively to the point, our brains are actually set up to be very conservative in the sense of they find their comfort zone and then they kind of stick with that. And often that comfort zone, is hard to change because whenever something is different, our brain immediately screams, danger, is this dangerous? And it's actually set up as a survival mechanism, but really it's about kind of stepping back and saying, hey, is this dangerous or different? And so we're actually fighting an uphill battle to start any new habit when our brain says, hey, we haven't done this before, are you sure that's okay? Even if it's like eating more vegetables, is this dangerous? For some people, they might be like, that's really dangerous, I'm never going to eat vegetables. But for the rest of us, trying to find those healthy habits is challenging. Another piece I'll add here is that we're increasingly put in an environment, I would say that an addictive environment, where with this attention economy, everybody's trying to get our attention, and they're making all of their things as addictive as possible. So, food has been engineered for a long time. Back, do you know when the Lay's potato chip company came up with the "Bet you can't eat just one" slogan? It was back in 1963.
Yeah.
So they were designing these things to be hard to resist. Actually, I'll another fun fact, that was the year that Weight Watchers was founded. So coincidence? Yes, but we can see how all of these things, whether it's food, whether it's experiences, whether it's social media, whether it's even our work, like these email notifications that were set up back when email was first set up. That is an intermittent reinforcement process that gets us hooked into things that people want us to be doing, that's their agenda, that's not necessarily our agenda. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. I would like to take a second here as well to see what the audience thinks as well about keeping habits, and whether they share my sentiment as well. So I am going to put up a poll. You should see a poll appear on the screen. And if you could all take a moment to answer, that will help us as well get a better understanding of how you think about habits in the context of work.
It won't let me vote, but I'll just put it out there mentally.
Okay, so far we have only yeses for question one. 90% of people have said yes, and 10% have said unsure. And in terms of the worst habit at work you'd like to break, procrastination comes up as number one, and anxiety and stress is number two. And I think it's interesting, right, when you talked about why it's so hard to keep a habit, and you talked about novelty, but then you also spoke about why it's so easy to form a habit that we may not want to engage in. So could you talk a little bit about why it's so much easier to form a habit that's seen as an addiction or a bad habit, but why it's so hard to form a healthy habit? So why do we face that difference in response?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are a number of factors that play a role here. If we look at, let's use food as an example. And so when you look at Doritos, for example, or Cheetos, it's not a coincidence that they're about the same bright orange, neon color. And they also have these, all of these factors that are designed in. The food engineers call this the bliss point, where they have this magic, combination of salt, sugar, fat to make things very addictive. And then also there are things like vanishing caloric density. So if you look at a Cheetos, it kind of mounts in your mouth, and your brain's like, "Did I just eat something? No, I should eat some, eat some more." And so there are a lot of things that are designed in to get our dopamine systems firing. So it can be, it can be surprise. It can be, things that jack that system. For example, with the bliss point, that's been shown to be really dopaminergic, so to speak. And then with behaviors, the same thing is true. So intermittent reinforcement, as I mentioned, is basically you don't know when something is going to happen. And that surprise element is baked into our survival mechanisms around like, oh, is that, what is that? Is that danger? Wasn't expecting that. So if you think of a healthy habit, we're kind of expecting it. Whereas all these other things are just yanking our attention in ways that we don't have a lot of control over. Does that get at your question?
Yes, it does. I think a follow-up question I have to that is, the good habits, I think there's an interesting point around they might not give us the same dopamine hit. But why, even if we do know something is good for us and we know we will get a dopamine hit from it, like waking up early in the morning to go for a run, why do we still find it really hard to motivate ourselves? And, why is it that we often choose to stay in bed for that extra half an hour instead of waking up to go for a run?
Yeah. So our brains have this system that determines and stores what's described as reward value for different behaviors. And this is actually how any habit is set up. And I think of it as the set and forget. So you set the value of a behavior and then you forget about the details so that your brain can work very efficiently and it doesn't have to relearn everything every day. Let's get to the waking up early example, but I want to use a simpler one first. Let's say broccoli versus chocolate. Okay. So if we've eaten broccoli for the first time, or we've eaten chocolate for the first time, our brain's going to compare that to all the other things that we've eaten, and it's going to place it somewhere in the reward hierarchy loop. I just want to highlight something. I was doing some research for I have a book on eating coming out in January called The Hunger Habit. And there's this, I found this YouTube video of a baby eating ice cream for the first time. And so, and you can find this all over the place, but I had never seen this before. And so, parent gives baby a lick of ice cream and baby's like, and then it goes, like shoves the whole thing in its face and it's like, I just won the lottery, because our body and our brain's like, this is calories, this is the perfect, calorie thing I'm getting. I'm salt and sugar and fat and all this. And what that says, the reason I mention that is that when our brain set up that reward value for something, it's hard to shift that. And so let's use the example of waking up early in the morning. So if we have set up this, it's like, oh, it feels good to sleep in.
Yeah.
If and we wake up early and we set an alarm, like I'm going to get up early, and we have kind of this goal to get up early, but we're kind of tired. Our brain's going to compare, what did it feel like to kind of crawl out of bed tired versus sleeping in more? And so when it compares those two behaviors, especially for a sleepy brain, it's kind of a no-brainer, especially, and also, add on top of that sleep deprivation that most of us have. So the way to shift that is to be, and let's use the exercise. So the way to shift that is to start to really focus in on the rewards of how good it feels to get out and exercise. And so anybody can do this. So we can think about like, oh, what's it take to get outside and exercise, versus what does it feel like after I've exercised? And that's a world of a difference, because we're like, oh God, it's cold outside, it's rainy, oh, I just don't feel up for it. Who's going to want to exercise when they're thinking about that? But if they look at the result of the exercise, that's what's going to drive the behavior. And this is why this process is called reward-based learning. If something is rewarding, we're going to do it again, but we have to remember what the result of the behavior is, not what it takes to get to it, get up and do the behavior itself. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. So if I want to wake up early tomorrow morning to go for a run, at the point where I wake up, I should tell myself what it feels like or how I feel at the end of that run. So
yeah, and just remember, you don't even have to tell yourself anything. This is the nice thing, is we don't, anytime we're trying to tell ourselves things, we tend to get stuck in our heads, like I should go for a run. So I highlight that, not that you're saying this, but I just highlight this for anybody that's like, oh yeah, I should go for a run. That joke about we should all over ourselves, it is true, right? And so here, instead of like, oh, this is what I will feel like, we can simply recall, what did it feel like the last time I went for a run?
I like that. So ground it more in a real experience. Yeah. And similarly, we have a question from someone in the audience who said, how can I break my bad habits of late evening snacking and drinking?
That is a great question. So let's, if drinking involves that 2-carbon fragment that we call alcohol, let's start with that piece. So if somebody has a habit of drinking some alcohol at night or in the evening, they can tell themselves, oh, I know the research that alcohol affects my REM sleep and affects, my sleep architecture and things like that. And it's, it's not good to do this, or if I drink too much, I wake up with a hangover. We can tell ourselves all those things, but it doesn't stop us from actually doing them. So let's take the alcohol and the snacking separately, but they're related. So if we drink some alcohol, it's also, it disinhibits our, our working memory and our brain. So our brain's like, well, feeling good, might as well have some food. And so if we're in the habit of pairing alcohol with food or late night snacking, and we're trying to tell ourselves I shouldn't snack at night, the alcohol is not going to help anything. So I just wanted to address that piece first.
Yeah.
With that, we can then, bring in what we just talked about. We can ask ourselves, what did I get the last time I drank alcohol at night? How well did that go? Right? If it's a weeknight or something like that. And then we can really feel into those results. And that's going to actually help shift that reward hierarchy, where it makes it easier to be like, yeah, not sure it's worth it. That little bit of pleasure that came from the buzz or the taste of the beer or the wine or the whatever, that wasn't so great. So now let's talk about that late night snacking, because this is something that we see a lot in our Eat Right Now program. My lab's actually studied this, where we can have people pay attention as they do that behavior. So we've done studies with people eating food that they didn't want to eat or overeating. And that often happens with late night snacking when it's paired with a television show or a movie or something like that, where somebody just wants to relax at night. And so they're like, oh, I'm going to have this snack while I watch the movie. And then snack's gone. They don't even remember eating it. So
Mm.
here with this, we can have people pay attention as they do the behavior. And it
Yeah.
turns out in one study that we published a couple of years ago, it only takes 10 or 15 times of somebody really paying attention as they overeat, for example, for that
Yeah.
reward value to drop below zero. And when that reward value shifts, the behavior shifts. Notice one critical piece here, which is that that does not involve willpower at all. This is not about telling ourselves we shouldn't snack. This is about feeling in our direct experience what we get from snacking. And I can't tell you how many people, whether it's patients or people in our program, say, I just don't feel so good after I snack at night.
Yeah.
Especially they don't sleep well, they wake up not feeling that great in the morning. And then they can compare that to when they don't snack at night.
Mm.
Feels good, they sleep better, all those things. And they've got to, just like exercise, how good it feels after we
Yeah.
exercise, they've got to recall that. How good does it feel when I haven't done that? How good does it feel the next morning? How much, how good's my sleep?
Yeah, it's really interesting about the power of awareness. That's essentially what it is, isn't
Mm-hmm.
it? Being mindful and
It
aware
is.
of your actions. This reminds me of the research you did as a psychiatrist, Brown, on addiction, and you described your patients who are coming to you because of addictions with smoking, and your
Mm-hmm.
research there around the gold standard of the mindfulness approach. I'd love if you could describe that, because I think that's a really good example of this as well.
Sure. So the punchline is that we did a randomized controlled trial and we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. Okay, 5 times. So when you look at it, what were we doing to get those results? First off, we weren't expecting it to be that strong. But when we started interviewing people and seeing and looking at the mediators of the effects and the moderators of the effects, it became pretty clear. So here, and I do this with my patients as well, whereas like somebody comes in, they want to quit smoking, I tell them to smoke. And they're like, my doctor just told me to smoke. I'm pretty sure smoking is not good for me. Everybody knows that smoking is not good for them, right? But I say, pay attention as you smoke. And not one single patient, this is over 20 years now that I've been a clinician, not one single person's come back and thanked me for, helping them savor that cigarette because it tastes so good. Cigarettes taste like crap, right?
Yeah.
That superheated smoke, all the carcinogens going into their lungs. It just doesn't, it's not like, oh, carcinogens, but it's like, it just doesn't feel and taste good. It doesn't smell good. Their breath is terrible. Their clothes are, smell like smoke. And when they start to see this, they wake up and they're like, I had a guy smoking for 40 years. And he's like, how did I not notice this before? He wasn't paying attention. He was distracted, right? It was a habit. So
Yeah.
this is a key aspect for any type of habit change in terms of helping us step out of unhealthy habits. I like the simple question. I'll just say, ask yourself, what am I getting from this, right? Feel into the results. So if somebody's overeating, they can feel into it. And their very, very wise body is going to say, okay, done. We're eating too much. This does not feel good, right? Or with the cigarette, hey, does not feel good, does not taste good, you know, and that makes it much easier to step out of the habit. And that's where we got, these 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment.
Yeah, that's incredible. Really, really incredible. And yeah, so applicable, I think, for all of us here today. I want to go back to the poll. And in the poll, we saw stress and anxiety as, a number one habit that people would like to break. And I think that's really interesting because we often don't think about stress at work as a habit or as an addiction. But do you think stress at work is an addiction? Would you call it an addiction?
Well, I would say so. The definition of addiction that I learned in residency is continued use despite adverse consequences. And so I would say I would put anxiety more in that along that spectrum than
Yeah.
stress. And I say that because the difference between stress and anxiety is that stress tends to have a clear precipitant.
Mm.
And so I would say some people are in the habit of getting stressed out over work deadlines, projects, giving a talk, whatever, giving a presentation, right?
Yeah.
And so if we map it out, we can see, the three elements to a habit, trigger, behavior, result. And so the trigger is, let's say, a work deadline. The behavior is that they get stressed about it. And the result is that, that stress doesn't feel very good in their body, right? It activates, their autonomic nervous system, all this, and which is not healthy for us. That when that precipitant goes away, the stress goes away. So it can be harder to see that kind of as an addiction unless we're constantly, getting stressed out. I'm sure we all know or can check in with ourselves to see, am I the type that gets really stressed when there's a project, or am I the type that doesn't get particularly stressed and kind of leans in, like, sees it as a challenge? Let's look at anxiety now. Actually, before I go on, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that distinction of threat versus challenge is an important one as well.
Yeah. Okay. So anxiety is trickier. And this was probably the most important thing that I never learned in medical school, which is that anxiety can actually be driven like a habit and even like an addiction. And the way that works is there was a guy, Thomas Borkovic, back in the 1980s suggested this, but this like totally was overshadowed by the release of Prozac into the world, and all the SSRIs coming on the market, and people thinking, oh, I can just take a pill and I'll be good to go. Unfortunately, pills are not magic, especially these. About 1 in 5 people shows a significant reduction in symptoms when they take it for anxiety, for an SSRI. So not a game changer. And there are actually some good studies in the UK showing that these SSRIs may be no better than placebo. So placing that controversy off to the side, I was struggling to help my own patients with anxiety. And so it's only 1 in 5. What do I do with the other 4? What if they have side effects, all these things? And so I started going back and looking at the literature. And when I saw this finding or this suggestion that anxiety could be driven like a habit, I was like, this is a game changer, because I know how to work with, I've been doing habit change stuff forever, and I never thought to apply it to anxiety. So the way anxiety works is where stress can have a clear precipitant, where we get stressed out, and that's the mental behavior. The feeling of anxiety itself may not have a specific precipitant. It might, but it often does not. And especially for people who are in the habit of being anxious, and I want to say that I did not misspeak there, are in the habit of being anxious. This is how it works. The feeling of anxiety triggers the mental behavior of worrying. Okay. So behaviors aren't just about eating Doritos. They're also about things that go on in our heads. So perseveration, where we're constantly worrying about something in the future, that mental behavior results in making us feel like we're in control. Here's the kicker here. We're not actually in more control when we worry than when we don't. And some could argue that we're in less control. We have less control because it makes it harder for our brain to think and plan, which is what our brain's trying to do. It's trying to reduce uncertainty in the future. But anxiety and worrying doesn't actually reduce that. It's been shown to be inversely correlated with actually, being productive and et cetera. So anxiety triggers the mental behavior of worrying, which results so this feeling of control or feeling like we're doing something, but also feeds back and makes us more anxious. And so with that loop being completed, we actually get into these anxiety worry spirals that actually make us more anxious and more worried. So we get in the groove and we start to get, in the habit of worrying. And for some people, when they are so stuck in worrying, where they're like, I have to worry about this, that might fall into the territory of continued use despite adverse consequences.
That's a really interesting framework when you think about a habit as that kind of trigger, behavior, reward loop. The applications then, to areas like anxiety that we wouldn't typically associate as a habit become much more meaningful. So yeah, thank you for bringing out that distinction. I'm aware we have quite a few questions and not much time left. So I have one final question, which is, we're all coming to the end of the year, setting our New Year's resolutions, thinking about all the amazing new healthy habits we're going to put in place for 2024. We also know how hard it is to sustain habits and sustain New Year's resolutions. So what are your top 3 tips that you can give us as we go into this period of setting New Year's resolutions?
Top 3 tips. The first one I would say is, so it's a two-parter. If you don't know how your brain works, you can't work with your brain. So tip number 1, learn how your brain works. And I'm sure you all are great at helping people with that. We've got some free resources on my Dr. Jud website that can help people kind of learn some of these basic things. But the idea here is you got to know how your brain works. And we've actually covered the basis there in terms of how any habit is formed, trigger, behavior, results, or from a brain standpoint or reward. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2, don't rely on willpower. For anybody that's tried it before, they know what I'm talking about. Willpower is more myth than muscle. We don't need to get into the details, but basically from a neuroscience standpoint, willpower is not even in the equations of behavior change. So when we look at how we shift behaviors, whether it's eating, smoking, or even anxiety, willpower is not even in there. And we can actually predict the outcomes quite a bit without even including that as a variable. So don't rely on willpower. So first, know how your mind works. 2, don't rely on willpower. And 3, instead of willpower, I would say discover your inner superpower of curiosity.
I like that.
And the reason I'm not just going to leave that as a cliffhanger, but the one-liner on that is curiosity is extremely helpful at helping us understand how our minds work. It's extremely helpful at helping us see the results of our behaviors. So if they're rewarding, we'll do them more. Like, oh, I exercised. Oh, that actually felt good. And in critically, it's also helpful in moments when we are stuck in worrying or we have a craving. So for example, if we have a craving, we try to fight that craving with willpower. How does that feel? Versus what does it feel like when we get curious about what a craving feels like? And this is what I do with my patients. This is what we do in our programs. We can flip that, oh no, I got to fight this, to, oh, what does this feel like in my body? And we can start to see that these cravings aren't as bad, dangerous, big, scary, ugly, anything like that. I talk in the hunger habits. One of my patients describes this as the craving monster. And anytime she resists the craving monster or runs from it, it just runs right after and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And what she learned was to turn toward it and not fight it, but open to it with curiosity. So superpower for sure.
I really like that. And actually, a lot of what we teach through our platform on stress is about, your response to stress is a big determinant of how your body will react as well. And so it's similar framework of, if you view that stress as a challenge instead of a threat, like preparing for a big presentation, that will then change, how your body will then respond to that situation. So I really like that framework. So we are at the end of time, but we have questions. So if you have just a quick, I'm going to pick one, and just a quick fire answer is someone has asked, they said that they want to create some videos for personal branding, but this new habit forming is so scary that it's hard for them to start. Do you have any advice on how they can break this?
Yeah, here I would say those 3 things that I mentioned will all apply here. So I won't reiterate those. But the other thing I would add here is to ask when something is different, when we're moving into new territory, ask the simple question: is this dangerous or is this just different? Right. And that helps us start to see and unpack where there might even be some other habit loops in there, where it's like self-judgment or, perfectionism or worry that we're going to fail. All of these can be mental habit loops themselves that we can unpack and start to work with.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice. Okay, well, Dr. Brewer, thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for joining and for being here and actually taking that first step to prioritizing your own health and your personal growth. And I encourage all of you to please take this advice and actually think after this session what practical takeaways you can implement as you get through this busy period and look at setting your New Year's resolutions for the year ahead. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the holiday season.